So we have today with us Marc Bergauer, Jabe Bloom, and Mosier, and we're having a little bit of a chat about some social practice theory-ish things. There was a Twitter thread Jabe posted about new word of the day, anecdata, and I think he provoked some interesting responses, long discussions later in the Twitter thread. Something about Marc and Jabe's different scrambled egg practices.
Yeah,
We could start there.
scrambled eggs.
So what is a social practice, and why do eggs matter in relation to social practices?
So social practice is a set of theory that tries to explain behavior from a sociological perspective. So it's trying to explain people's behavior, not from a psychological perspective, right? So that's the first thing, kind of differentiate, right? So it's a sociological theory. It's not a psychological theory. So it's less to do with what's happening in your head and more to do what's happening in many people's heads at the same time, or maybe not even in their heads, but in their relationships with materials and opinions and things like this. So the basic theory of it that I like to use with people, Marc and Chris have been playing with these ideas as well, is from a woman named Elizabeth Shove, and she says that a social practice is basically the interaction between materiality. So let's say like a tool or anything that could be thought of as being material, or in Heideggerian word equipmental, and that means a thing that is used to do something else. So symbols and words and other things can also have this like nature of equipmentality. But the idea is that there's a set of materiality. There's a set of things that you use to achieve some end. And then there's skill in using those things. So there's some sort of ability or ability to use something, a skill. And there's also kind of a general idea inside of the skill that you can judge whether or not someone else is doing it well. So that is this idea that there's, in practice, you're reproducing something. You are recreating something. So you're not practice is not about kind of a novel behavior. It's not about creating new things. It's about reproducing other previous behaviors. And then the last thing is meaning. So a meaning is kind of the why you would produce something. So in social practice theory and a lot of the actual literature, the practices are quite funny in that there are things like washing dishes or taking baths or taking showers or doing laundry or things like this. And part of the reason is because a lot of the social practice theory literature is trying to figure out really simple questions about how you change people's behaviors or how you change people's practices. And those concerns around things like showering and bathing and all these things have environmental impacts, especially consumption of hot water, blah, blah, blah. So, yeah, so the idea of meaning there would be that we bathe because we want to smell the right way, or we want our hair to be done the right way. And the bathing is a process by which we perform a practice that has an outcome that has a socially accepted result, right? So that you appear in some way.
Yeah, so Marc, tell me a little bit about how you make scrambled eggs.
Okay, so just so we can compare a little bit how you can perform a practice. So I think that's important. I will maybe add to what Jabe said. So first of all, practices are performed. Also practices, so this is why I started to dislike use the word behavior in this context. When we talk about behavior, we look at the person. But as it becomes clear, since we have material already in it, practice is an interaction in the world.
Yep.
And so where you interact, with what you interact, other people participating in the practice, etc., all of this matters. So I started to find when we talk about behaviors that creates a fuzzy sort of idea of something concrete that in terms of practices becomes actually really difficult to use. So I think more performances rather than behaviors, because performances are perceived, so that it has that interactive element, which at least in a lot of psychological lingo, behavior often doesn't have. Yeah, so we're trying to understand from a psychological point of view behavior as a result of your internal motivation, where something like practice theory actually would say what we call behavior is driven by the outside constraints of the material, of your location, of all of these things, other people, etc.
Yep.
Meaning, etc. Yep. Scrambled eggs. So when I make scrambled eggs, first okay, so this is now the keto version because I'm doing keto since May. You could substitute the cream that I'm starting with milk or water. So one of the things I learned is if you put the seasoning initially in the cream and mix it, it mixes better when you later put the eggs in. But so I create a mixture out of cream, seasoning, and eggs in a bowl and whip it really well until it's really homogeneous. Yeah, like there's no white bits or see-through bits on their own. Yeah. Then I have butter in a pan, and essentially I'll try the lowest heat that I can. So on my cooker, heat goes up till 9. I usually start at a 2.5 maybe. And then I wait and very patiently let it slowly coagulate and curdle, and constantly remove things from the bottom. The result is a relatively creamy, but color-wise uniform scrambled eggs.
How would you evaluate this?
So, oh yes, Jabe.
I think they're like almost like a custard is the way I like to think of them. I mean, I also think of them as being a very European scrambled egg. Like Marc's not the only one who's ever made scrambled eggs for me like that. But they're loose, they're wet. Yeah, so I really like them. They taste awesome. And I also, part of the point of trying to use this as an example for social practice is they're clearly scrambled eggs. They use a pan on a stove, and you mix the eggs with an instrument, and you heat them until they're cooked. It's exactly what you would describe as scrambling eggs, I think. But I think if you look at like an American way, like I bet if I went to your house, Ben, and we made scrambled eggs, you might crack the eggs in a vessel and mix them up quickly, and then pour them in, probably over higher heat is usually what I do. And the result of it is usually kind of a fluffy egg is often what's the goal. In fact, like a lot of times in America, we'll put like either cream or milk in there, which increases the amount of steam in the egg so that it makes them even fluffier. And the first time Marc was here, I actually made him something that's called fried scrambled eggs. And fried scrambled eggs is that you crack the eggs directly in the pan over pretty medium heat, not really hot, but medium heat. And you fry them for like 60 seconds. So you get like a little bit of a fry, and then you scramble them in the pan. So it's kind of like a mix between a fried egg and a scrambled egg. And I served that to Marc. He was like, I've never seen anything like this before. And that's part of the reason why we kind of got into this idea. But again, the idea of it is that like practice isn't the way that you evaluate practice is in whether or not someone's competent in it, right? And therefore, there's not like a set criteria for what it is that means you are practicing, right? So other kind of examples like playing guitar, there's lots of ways to perform the practice of playing guitar, right? There's not one. And everybody would recognize you've got the instrument, you're playing the instrument, you're making something like music, you're practicing guitar. I might not like it, I might not think you're competent at it, but I would recognize that you're doing the performance, the practice of guitaring. And the same thing happens here, though, with these eggs is we don't evaluate, we don't predefine what the method is for a practice. A practice is something kind of you learn by interacting with the world or being shown something. It's not quite like tacit knowledge. It's not, tacit knowledge is often like, how do you ride a bike? You have to learn by being shown to ride the bike, and then it becomes very hard to verbalize what riding a bike is like. But so that's very tacit knowledge. And practice isn't quite that. Practice is more like, I don't remember how I learned this. I just did it with other people, and then I like compared my result to their result. Like the way I know how to make eggs is I made eggs, and if they tasted like my mom made eggs, then I was doing the right thing. And if they didn't, then I'd kind of screw around with it until they did. And so same thing, like I like, one of the reasons I like showering as an example is because like, who taught you to shower? Almost certainly nobody really sat you down and like gave you a manual on how to shower, right? Somebody said like you turn the knobs to make it hot and cold, and they kind of generally showed you that, but you have to figure out what hot and cold is and what you like for hot and cold and all that kind of stuff. And so you get this idea that I think you have to be careful with practice, because the idea isn't to say that the practice emerges from the materiality alone, because that's the whole point, is that it doesn't just arise from the materiality, but the materiality contributes to it, and the skill is from practice. Anyway,
so like, do you learn a practice? How do you become someone who practices?
Yeah, so I think, well, and Mark, maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of unconscious, conscious type stuff, the stuff that we've talked about before with like Chris Matz, because I know you've talked to Chris about that a bunch of times. But in general, the answer is practice is learned, and it's often learned unreflectively, right? So it's you don't not like thinking about it. You're not like, I need to learn how to cook these eggs better. I need to be more analytical or more thoughtful about my egg making. You just kind of like do it, right? And so there's this idea that practice is often about doing something without really entirely being conscious of it. Like there's extremes of it, right? Like the most extreme version of it is like the practice of driving, where almost anybody has driven down a highway long enough that they wake up in the middle of driving and go, "Huh, what was I doing?" I mean, I was driving because I didn't drive off the side of the road, but I don't really remember what was happening for the last 10. I couldn't describe to you what happened for the last 10 minutes, right? I wasn't there. So practice has a bit of that feel to it, that nature to it. So, and that's why you learn by practicing, is by doing the thing you learn to do the thing. And then there's kind of like conscious practice and or what kind of reflexive practice. More like thinking through something with sets of theory, or actively, consciously being aware of what you're doing, and that's a different form of practice, I think.
Okay, so we've got this idea that practicing can be done, and there are probably different ways of us doing so more consciously, or with different levels of consciousness scoped to different kinds of things. Marc, it sounds like you have some background knowledge that maybe you could lay down some interesting kind of how do we approach practice deliberately? Maybe it might be an interesting sort of question to start with.
So I'm actually struggling with this whole deliberate practice, so it's interesting you throwing that at me. Maybe my struggle might be helpful to actually reflect on this. A lot of practices that we learn, we don't even think about whether we should learn them. They're just part of our socio-technical environment. Starts with childhood, where you start copying practices. So you see your parents or your siblings performing them, and you just start performing them too, without thinking about, should I do this, should I not do this? It's just lots of things are done. I think that's very articulated, especially if you grow up religious, because especially for religion, you learn to do a lot of things as a kid that you need to get to teenage year at least to start having the conversation of why do they make sense and what's the purpose of them. So you get a very simplistic view as a kid on it, but it doesn't actually explain any of the detail of the practice. You need to get some sort of an understanding of the whole religious mythology and symbolism of blah, blah, blah. By the time you can start seeing, oh, that's why I do it exactly this way. That's it. So practices have a lot of that element. Equally, so like you could say practices in a job. Often you start because you start working around the people that do the practice. And some of the people who have studied how do we actually learn practices say exactly that. So for example, there is a study about how do we teach safety on a building site. And what they observed was that people actually learn the safety aspects of construction as they learn construction. So let's say you start learning how to build a wall. The people who teach you how to build a wall do it by showing you how to build a wall. And you start building walls, and they might say, oh, don't do that because, and don't do that because. And that's, so partially you learn how to be a good craftsman, but at the same time you learn where is the danger. They start seeing you doing things, and they're pointing out, here's a boundary you need to respect.
Yep.
But I also think, of course,
that part of the way that works is it's not necessarily a don't do that logically, it's a don't practice that, so you actually just don't learn to do it. Does that make sense? Like, don't do it that way, so you don't do it that way, so you don't learn that, right? So it's not like you start building a wall and go, okay, let me go down the checklist of things I'm not supposed to do. You just build the wall the way you should build the wall, because it's the only way you've practiced building the wall, because people have stopped you from building it the wrong way. Sorry.
Yeah. So deliberate would maybe mean, in this context, you are allowed to go and build a few walls that will fall in on themselves, just so you see the consequences. That never happens, yeah? So as you are building the wall that you're building will be used for something for real. So hence, a experienced practitioner just says, this is the way to do it, not how you just did it, yeah? And so also it's very difficult, so that's why they started looking at it this way, is because it's very difficult for an outsider and an observer to come and say, here are the safety practices, yeah? They don't exist. There aren't any safety practices. There's just good practice.
Yep.
So deliberate practice for me is maybe the attempt when you actually really start to see the value of a practice that you would like to acquire, but actually in your environment there's no, let's say, normal way of learning it. There are no real practitioners that you can observe and that would mentor you while you start performing. So deliberate practice means I have deliberately to create the context in which I can have this experience. I have to almost artificially put it together so that I have, which means you constantly need to put in this effort of creating the experience that you're seeking. It's not natural, it's not. And I started to also think that while that often might be the only way to actually get into the practice, it's probably not a good way to master the practice, or to there will be things that you miss, and because it's all artificial, there will be also things that the people who could tell you what you're missing are missing. Yeah, they aren't there. And so one effect where we see that is when we're actually saying, okay, we take you out of your environment and we're now showing you safety stuff about your practice. Yeah. Like we want to, all the risky, all the, yeah. And then people go back and they actually still make those mistakes in the context when it appears because, so as I say, because they were taught it in a decontextualized manner and they have no experience how to recontextualize what they've been taught. So they need to have the experience before they, oh, now I know why that mattered. Yeah. So often once you have the negative experience, you start to realize that what is the element of the decontextualized information that you now need to integrate. And so practices, that's maybe a crucial point. So Jabe pointed out the three things, meaning, material, and competence, but the practice is an act of integration.
Yep.
And if you think about it, so my metaphor is it's like a dance of three elements, because it's also not so that you can have one aspect of the three leading the other two to advance a practice. You can, so let's say, for example, you have a technological practice. So something we do in a tech environment, like looking after data, yeah? So I can give you a new database, yeah, that can do fancy things that the database that we used previously couldn't do, yeah? Well, if I only look at the material, I will then still use the same kind of competences and the same kind of meaning that I used before, and it's unlikely that I get much value out of having a new database, yeah?
Yep.
So I need then to suddenly reflect on, okay, so now I have this techie thing that can suddenly do things that the techie thing before didn't do. How do I need to adjust the practices? And usually the transformation of the practice should be led also by a change of the meaning, yeah? So I'm no longer so these things aren't integrated for the same purpose anymore. We have now a evolved purpose, so to speak. The meaning has to change. And when you start thinking this through for anything particularly, what you realize is, oh, as soon as one thing did a step, the other two things have to be moved alongside, yeah? And actually, as you move the other things, one of the other things will probably be the one that informs the next step. Oh, now that I've done this, I also want to do that. And then you pull. So it's a constant dance of the three.
I think there's like,
so
go ahead. Sorry.
That Jabe was playing to was the competence model. So there's a 4 competence model, and we mentioned Chris Matt's. So I'm using here, I think, so if it's a bad articulation, it's mine. Chris Matt's has an excellent articulation of this that I tried to reproduce. So the 4 competence model basically is you have 4 stages. You start with unconscious, unconscious incompetence. Then you become conscious about your incompetence. Then you become consciously competent, and then you get to unconscious incompetence. So let's use driving as a metaphor. As a kid, when you see your parents drive a car, yeah, you think this is dead easy, and you really can't understand why don't they let me. And then occasionally your mother or your dad might say, okay, you can now sit in the driver's seat, the engine is switched off, but you can move the steering wheel and I'll let you do the blinkers and you can push the pedals and the blah, blah, blah. And you say, as a kid, you say, okay, there's not really that much to it, right? There's just a few things that you do, yeah? And you basically can't wait till you're old enough and they'll let you out, and yeah? Oh, finally I can drive. Yeah, I have to take a few lessons, but that's good, easy peasy. And then you go to your first lesson, and you start to realize how a clutch is in real life. And then you sort of go, this is difficult. This is hard. I don't know what your experience was, but my first driving experience was literally existential crisis. Will I ever be able to master a clutch? Yeah, I think that was the most scary thing for me. Will I ever master a clutch? So you just moved from unconscious incompetence to conscious. You suddenly realize there is a practice, and it's not easy. I need to learn it. It will take time, and I might not succeed, yeah? But then you actually get better, and you get to your exam and pass the test, and that's probably where you're in the middle of conscious competence. You know now effectively how to drive a car. You can think about it, and if you concentrate and keep it all together, you can drive a car safely in traffic. And then a few years on, what happens to you is what Jabe described earlier. You suddenly realize, oh, I've driven for the last 10 minutes, and I have no idea what the traffic was. I could not tell you whether there was a queue at a red light or any of these details. I have no That's unconscious competence. So the crucial thing about why Chris Matz loves this model is that when you go from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, what you start to realize is the value of the practice. You might not yet understand the full value, but you start to realize there's something worth knowing. There's something worth being capable of doing, yeah? And it requires practicing to master. So you now are conscious about the value and you have some idea of the learning path in front of you that will get you there. And just as a closing, there is a lovely clip from John Cleese where he explains what being stupid is, yeah? And why stupid people, or people that appear stupid to people who have competence, why we have such a hard time to understand why they don't know that they're stupid. If you do not understand the value, if you don't have achieved conscious incompetence, as a kid that sees their parents around, you literally don't think there is anything to it. Yeah, you don't understand the value, you don't understand have any concept of the practice in it. And so people who are stupid about subjects will riff believing that they're extremely competent. Yeah, you do not understand that difference. And mostly the only way to understand that difference is experience. It cannot be explained, or hardly ever explained to you, so that you suddenly just reflectively would latch on to, oh, there is something. You need to experience that I'm incompetent, I'm failing, this isn't working. That sort of experience is where it starts that you appreciate the practice, yeah? So it's a very useful model. So we are thinking about it every now and then in terms of practice theory, but practice theory itself actually doesn't seem, we couldn't find anybody who made that link other than Matz, who immediately leaped onto it.
And I think, you know, to me, that's an interesting version of kind of reflexive practice or reflective practice, kind of Schoen's version of learning, where one goes from practicing to reflecting on practice. So you get the difference between like learning guitar, playing guitar, practicing guitar, and then maybe recording yourself and listening to yourself play guitar, and then like taking notes. Like reflective practice is this like doing the thing and then trying to actually observe yourself doing the thing. So it's like almost like being your own audience in a way. So you're reflecting back on what you did. And that is a moment that, you know, in the kind of conscious versus unconscious incompetence, you have a moment where you can hear yourself. You know, like anybody who's ever like spoken on stage and then watched the video of themselves afterwards has had, you know, the usual description of it is kind of impostor syndrome, but it's really partially like realizing how incompetent you are in relation to your expectation of your competence, right? Like, oh, I thought I was actually a really good public speaker, but clearly I've seen other people speak in public, and now I've seen myself speak in public, and these things don't add up correctly. You know, it's frustrating, and I think part of the frustration of imposter syndrome is you kind of like get this moment where you're like, why didn't anybody tell me I suck? And of course the answer is because you probably don't suck as much as you think you do, right? You're probably just being hypercritical, and you're having this very kind of crisis of like for the first time you've ever reflected on yourself, like that type of stuff often. So anyway, I think there's like a couple other things that I thought was really interesting. The main one was, you know, Marc's description of building a wall points out another thing about social practice, which I think is super interesting. And to introduce that, first of all, like I want to point out again that practice is about reproducing something, and part of what is reproduced is the opportunity to practice, right? So like being being a wall builder is partially about having opportunities to build walls, right? So these two things are actually related. If you can't practice building a wall, you don't get better at building walls, right? And so there's a feedback loop here. And so this reproduction, this kind of ability to reproduce the conditions necessary for practice points to this other weird thing, which is that practices are interrelated to themselves, right? So like driving to a work site, creating mortar, cutting stone. All of these could be considered to be separate practices, but they're also practices that are related to each other in a way that creates the conditions necessary for practicing building a wall. Yeah. So part of learning is actually recognizing that there are kind of clusters. Marc will give us the Chauvian terms, I'm sure, because he was poking me about them earlier. But I just like to think of them as clusters, and they're stable clusters. And what I mean by stable is reproducible, right? So in other words, the clusters of practices allow you to practice, and they're interrelated. If you only do one of the practices, often you won't be able to reproduce it if you don't reproduce these other things as well, right? Really kind of silly versions of it, like if you do continuous integration and you don't do test-driven development, maybe that's not going to work out well in the long run. If you do software development and you don't do software architecture, you probably get away with it for a little while, but maybe architecture is partially about establishing the conditions necessary to do software development. So if you stop doing it, eventually you consume all of the software architecture credits you have, and you can't reproduce the practice of software development anymore, right? So I think that that's interesting, and it points to another weird side thing that comes back to the maturity mapping that Marc and Chris have been doing, which is this. If you think through a practice lens and you stop thinking about, I like Marc's behavior critique, the psychological behavior versions of this. The other thing you end up with is that software architecture, operations, product development, architecture, management, these aren't roles, they're clusters of practices, and they don't belong to people, they belong to a social system, right? So what you end up with is this idea that what you would want to analyze is not whether or not you have the right people in the right roles, but whether or not you have the right clusters of practices to achieve the thing you're trying to do, and whether those clusters are actually relating to each other effectively or not, whether they're in balance or out of balance, right? And the result of this is that you end up, I think, being far better served to do things like skills liquidity analysis, which then would lend itself to saying, okay, here are the skills and the liquidity of the skills, and how are those skills related to each other, and what are the materialities involved in those skills, and why are they being done, what's the meaningfulness of them. Okay, great. Now we have a thing that we can talk about as a cluster or as a map of a set of practices. And I think this becomes really interesting in a lot of very productive ways for having conversations about evolving practices, because I think that these stabilities are not emergent solely from the context the way normally people talk about the context. It's not purely emergent from the market. It's not purely emergent from the tools. It's not purely emergent from the consultant that you brought in. The stability of the skills has to do with whether or not you have created a cluster that's stable of the different practices. And this means that they're kind of like it becomes more important to know the ways in which the practices relate than it is that the practices relate to something outside of itself, right? And I think that can become very powerful ways of thinking about how you would want to mature an organization, as what you would want to look for then instead of is, I'm not evaluating roles, I'm not evaluating people, I'm not evaluating the tools or the consultants that I bring in. What I'm evaluating is, have I established a stable cluster of practices that allows me to reproduce those practices long enough that the teams involved can become competent in those practices, right? So you could say like, hey, I want to do TDD in Oracle with CI/CD pipelines that are secure. Okay, great. So you've named 3 primary practices. What are the other supporting practices you need around those things in order to just be able to do those practices themselves safely, or be able to reproduce those practices? It's kind of like what you're talking about, the wall idea, right? And then you say, okay, great. So you get up to a level of competency where you can reproduce that practice over and over again, and then you become competent in it because you're able to practice over and over again without breaking something, right? Now you've got that stable cluster, but you don't want to stop, right? You want to do other things. You want to learn more things. You want to mature the practices. And this maturity would be determining another cluster of practices that you wanted to achieve and figuring out how to create that cluster stably, right? And I think that idea of kind of a punctuated equilibrium of the evolution of practices inside of organizations, and seeing the practices as kind of configurations or constellations, just becomes really interesting for me.
Okay, so it seems like we're not going to be able to avoid talking about maturity models, and you bringing up punctuated equilibrium is kind of interesting because I'm thinking of you talking about snails right now. And so let's talk about the wrong way, or the maybe the less effective way, the high failure way of thinking about maturity of skills in organizations. Maybe the naive version of this, right? So you have something that you evaluate some individual on some basis. Let's say so-and-so, do they know test-driven development? And we evaluate that individual on some arbitrary scale that we've decided to follow. Maybe it's the same arbitrary scale that everyone else seems to follow, whatever, like we're sharing that, I guess. But what does that dispose you to do then as an organization when it comes to managing your skill clusters? What is the default outcome of this individualistic, skill by skill, atomistic kind of way of managing maturity? What is the default outcome?
So in my experience, the problem that we're trying to avoid is how do I be like Google from where I am? Okay, let's go analyze Google's current practices. And then we'll just say, you should do those practices. That's how you'll be like Google. So you should set your stuff up this way. You should have these tools. You should instruct people that this is the right mindset to have. This is the right set of meanings to have. And you should train them to use those tools to achieve those outcomes, right? So again, you could use social practice theory to analyze how Google does a thing, right? But the result of that is probably not effective. And kind of like, I like Andrew Clay Schaefer has this kind of very good visual model for this, which is like he's got a guy, and the guy does like handstand push-ups, which I should learn how to do so I could like demo it. But I can assure you that I cannot do it. But what it is, guy does a handstand and then, does a push-up. If you imagine me upside down, that's what he's doing. And you look at it and you're like, okay, so, Google's a company and you're a company, so just do what Google does. This is kind of like saying you're a human and the guy doing the handstand push-ups a human, just go do it. It's clearly a thing that a human can do. But it misses the fact that there was a set of previous practice clusters, these kind of stable, reproducible ways that allowed this person to create the right set of muscle memory, strength, endurance, blah, 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 required to move to the next cluster and the next cluster that eventually leads him to, A, I can do a handstand, And then B, I have enough body strength to push my entire body weight up and down while doing a handstand. And so knowing what the outcome is, knowing that you want to do a handstand push-up does not have anything to do with adopting that practice. That's just the goal, whatever. I mean, I say to a lot of organizations I work with, like, listen, you guys, I don't understand why you're still arguing what the goal is. Everybody in the room is generally in agreement that you want to do X, Y, or Z, right? Like, you have a general agreement on what you want to do. That's not actually your problem. The problem is you can't do that thing that you want to do. So let's talk about how to get there, how to transition from where you are to there, right? And focus more on the movement towards that goal than the goal itself, which is kind of usually pretty irrelevant, frankly.
Yeah. And what Andrew would talk a lot about is how are you changing your everyday behaviors to basically start tending towards becoming someone who can build the prerequisite skill clusters necessary to aspirationally do handstand push-ups.
Yep.
The video is from the Phoenix folks, and I actually, for a little bit, was trying to get more fit or exercise at all. Let's be honest.
Yep.
And what I took away from what Andrew was talking about that though was, how do you quite literally start? Because one of the things Andrew points out is that if you try to do handstand push-ups, in fact, you are probably likely to harm yourself.
That's right. Yep.
You're going to hurt yourself.
Yep.
I was actually very honestly tempted to attempt to do a handstand push-up right now.
Yeah.
On the call. And then the reason I don't want to do that is because then I had film record of me hurting myself.
Premeditated injury.
Yeah. But like that kind of idea is completely, almost entirely oriented against the way that we think about transforming.
Yeah.
Marc, you were going to say something a little bit earlier, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on this because I suspect there's some detail or there's some clarity around this idea of maturity and the wrong way to do things. I'm curious what your perspective is on this as well.
Okay, so I'm just going to add, the example that Jabe's just given is essentially something you can achieve for yourself. So who's the judge whether you achieved it or not? You are, yeah? You will need help. You will need people who have done this before you, but you decide the point where you say, I know this now good enough, now I want to focus on something else, yeah? If you're an athlete, then maybe you start saying, okay, I want other people to acknowledge that I can do that. So I might do this in my gymnastic routine. I think it's called floor in English or so. and I want to get the scores for it, yeah? But even then, you sometimes have, I don't know, you watch sports people when they did and they say, I was judged unfairly, I think that was really good, and the trainer says it was really good, and why didn't they give me the scores for that? Most practices we don't do for ourselves, yeah? Most practices we do to achieve a social outcome, by which we mean an outcome that we want to achieve with others. And then maturity becomes a very tricky thing to actually look at. So first of all, classical maturity models, they all have certain inherent problems, especially if we're talking about complexity. So they're always somewhat linear, as in they suggest that there is a particular way how you become good at a practice. They always suggest that the linearity that you need to follow is predictable, as in we can actually design a 3-stage certification program for you, at the end of which you will be really good. What we experience is people go through these maturity models and still fail at the practice when they have to perform it in a specific environment and facing a specific problem. So Chris McDermott, the other Chris that we often talk about, had this insight at one point that he says, what if maturity has to be decided in the context? So maturity can only be evaluated in your specific context. So the corollary, thank you, got there, of that is that maturity essentially is your environment giving you the feedback that you are adding value to the environment. So maturing a practice in my book means a practice is performed in a social technical socio-eco-technical environment, and you're improving the practice if the environment as a whole, the whole system, can generate more value from you doing the practice. So a feedback that you might get that you're doing that is that the people who can constrain your environment actually introduce things that nurture the practice. They say, okay, we get value of him. Now we're going to make resources available to you. We maybe want more people to start practicing. So we're putting more people, let's say, into a team or a group of people that are doing this practice so they can learn the practice, etc. Yeah. So that is a feedback that you could say, oh, well, yeah, we're doing something useful. And if we would take an axis of a Wardley map, then we could say, you're at the good end when the system as a whole would reflect and say, yes, this practice is essential to us as a system. Even people who aren't practitioners of that practice, but participants in the system, will know about the practice. They will have heard about it, and they might even recognize it when they see it, yeah? Or at least they can recognize artifacts in the system being produced by the practice. I mean, the other big issue that we have usually in the way we're developing skills in organizations is that the traditional way is that we're trying to develop individuals. So we say a competence is something that an individual has to learn. So when we say we want to do, we want to improve, let's say, team performance, we go and say, okay, the individuals need to learn things individually, yeah? We're going to send them on courses. And then when they come together, suddenly the team will be better. That never works. Jabe actually articulated this first, that it says you need to bring the skill to the people. Yeah. What that means is you maybe bring a coach in who has some experience in doing the practice in other contexts. And in my experience, you cannot be a good coach if you haven't practiced this particular thing in just one environment. You need to have experience from having tried it in multiple environments. So you actually start to understand which of these things I need to vary in a new environment, in a new context, and which of these things maybe I should stick to the static thing, yeah? And they're not predictable as well. So if I learn to practice in one environment, I can't tell you which of these things might turn out to be the stable bits that I can decontextualize and take into another context, and which of these things are context specific, as in when I try the practice in another environment, I have to figure out those aspects, yeah? Not predictable. I would say the predictability, or it might be also the anticipation, the ability to anticipate some of them, comes with having experienced the practice in varied environments. And often what we find is that experts, people are really good at teaching practices and make them happen in new contexts, have actually done them in lots. So I have a minimum number of 3 before you actually understand what the variability might be, before you just get an idea of the range of that variability. But you might need, I don't know, depending on the complexity of the practice itself, a lot of environment before you really get an idea, yeah, these are the static things, these are the movable things, or these things can be reproduced under certain, so these are the conditions that need to be present that I can copy sort of these aspects of the practice. And if these conditions aren't around, then I have to reinvent these aspects of the practice. So the way I articulate this is there's also another problem that we're experiencing with practice theory that I need to get to, but I want to quickly point out there is an inherent advantage actually for the individual that we're looking at things through the lens of practice theory rather than the traditional way. So Chris McDermott articulates this is looking at it from a sociological point of view versus a psychological point of view. When we say the quality of practice, etc., depends on the skill of the individual in a learned thing, in a thing that can be taught, etc., then if things aren't going wrong, aren't going well, we immediately have the blame game. Yeah, you don't know how to use a JVM properly enough, or you don't know how to do TDD well enough, the way you're doing TDD, and that's why we're not succeeding. If you look at it through the practice lens, then the quality of the practice is in the integration. So what we also see that people with some, let's say, learning aptitudes for certain things, so most of us have developed, because we have been practicing in a certain knowledge field for a long time, we have an aptitude to learn new things in that field more quickly. Which basically means we only need a little competence and a little familiarization with the specific tool, because we have learned similar competences before and we have learned similar tools before. And what we also learned is the dance, integrating of the three things in other contexts. We've got really good at integrating, yeah? So even with relatively little specific knowledge of a competence, a skill, or the tool, we might actually still achieve relatively great outcomes because we're good at the dancing. And one way to look at this or see where that works is jazz, where you can put jazz musicians together and they need to know let's say somebody takes the lead initially about, so what is the chord progression and the rhythm and blah, blah, blah that we need. And a good jazz musician needs to know very little to start with, often just the key. And within a few bars, they start joining in. And they might still make little mistakes because they're not quite getting it, but often the audience wouldn't even notice that. Yeah, only the performer knows, oh yeah, I'm not quite with you yet. But within about 30 seconds or so, they got enough little context that because they're good at integrating, yeah, they can make it work that for the audience, this all could sound like a designed piece composed from A to Z. Yeah, nothing is improvised. So as a listener, you don't know, you're sitting there, I don't know, if you listen to Sun Ra or Art Ensemble of Chicago, the first time you listen to this stuff, you think this is written out from A to B. And then you start to realize, oh, I listened to the same piece on 3 different recordings, like live clips or something. Every time they're really different because they're improvising, yeah? And improvisation is part of how these two groups or musicians, how they operate. Improvisation is a crucial part of their performance. Integration is what they celebrate, not the exact competence of the chord progression, what's allowed in and what's not exactly how you play the instrument, because you can give these musicians, like, here's a bass you never played with an amp you never used, yeah? Still will only take them a few seconds, 20, 30 seconds until they tune the thing so that it sounds good. This is all the art of integration. But you can't integrate on your own. You can only integrate in the environment with the support of the mind within the constraints of environment. So at that point, suddenly the quality of the performance, yes, there is a necessity of some basic skills and some basic knowledge, but the outcome becomes what everybody does together. So if we look at work through practice theory and we say it's not working as well as we think it could, what we start focusing on is the integration, not just of one individual and their skills, and not just one material, but all the materials, all the individuals. So the focus goes away from looking at, so if I look at it as a network that is performing, from the notes to the interactions. You still have to have minimal skill or characteristics in the node so that the network can perform these things, but whether the network performs them well or not is much more down to how the interactions are enabled and what the configuration enables or constrains or governs, rather than the characteristics of a node. And so an example I use to explain that is the internet. So we have Postle's law that said you have to be very tolerant in accepting inputs and you have to try to be as coherent as possible in the outputs. So it's worth looking it up because the wording of Postle is better, but that's roughly what it says. And the outcome that we're seeing is that the internet works with a huge variety of people, devices, protocols, etc. And for some reason, it still works. If we would have designed something like the internet from the scratch, we probably would have said, oh yeah, all the routers have to more or less work the same way. All the switches have to more or less work the same way. But what we find is a huge variety in switch design, router design, and as it happens, actually, because we agreed initially, early days, at be tolerant at what inputs you're accepting and try to be coherent in your outputs, the variety of things actually makes it more resilient, makes it more adaptable, it gives the network qualities that a designed network would never be able to exhibit. So equally, when you take this into work, what we believe, and what I think I've experienced, for example, in a band or in organizations or teams that work really well, was you set sort of the conditions well enough, so we could say the disposition of the network at the beginning, that it allowed enough variety to happen within, so the system could self-organize to something so good that you would have never been able to design that. So it's allowing the interactions to sort of figuring themselves out in a mutual dance, in a continuous, like, oh, let's try this, or this might be slightly better, okay, let's go with that and try something else elsewhere, etc. That enables really good stuff to emerge, rather than, hey, I figured out, I have this big idea, I know how to do it, approaches. So what that means is traditional approaches to organizational development, in that sense, or team development, team effectiveness, are all individual. Like, you talk to these people, you work with these people, they always go in the end and say, yeah, but it's individuals that have to do the work to make this better. Practice theory will basically say, no, we're just looking at value outcomes for the system as a whole. Are we setting the right freedoms? Are we constraining are we setting boundaries at the right kind of positions within the network? And then let's see what happens. Let it emerge. You allow for emergence. And the advantage for the individual, just to, maybe I haven't made that clear enough, but the advantage for the individuals is it's actually much safer to try things. It's much safer to go out of your comfort zone. It's much safer because essentially everybody's expected to do that. Everybody's almost encouraged to do that. And as soon as you realize, oh, that was one thing too far, you say, okay, we discovered a boundary. Let's all start now respecting this boundary from here on in. Or let's not push at this boundary until we maybe have some new competence and some new practice that maybe allows us to cope with the failure that we experienced over there in a way that it might no longer be a failure. So Jabe said that, in a sense, I can't remember, what was it? Social safety, or?
Yeah, I can remember.
I don't want to use the epistemic justice because I'm still not really on top of what that really means, or struggle still a little bit. I might contribute towards that it allows systems to be more humane, more fun. If you have experienced teams in which work was fun, one part of the fun was that there was constant experimentation. They were constant, let's not do this like we did yesterday. Let's push this edge a bit. Let's go and dare a little bit over there. And if things go wrong, nobody says, oh yeah, but it was your idea. Yeah. If things go wrong, it says, oh, we found something new. We learned something new about the system overall. We learned something new about the environment, etc. How can we use that? The attitude is not looking at the node. The attitude is one of focusing on interactions. And only if we really understand the interactions and we say there is a deficiency of a node in supporting this interactions, will we say, okay, maybe we'll sit you down now and talk you through some of these things that we others already know how to do.
And that, I love the band metaphor. When you think about, like, so, you think about, again, reproducing practice, right? So like there's this idea of something happening over and over again. And there's two ways to think about that, or probably more than two ways, but two primary ways. And I think the illusionary way is kind of like a Platonic form version of it. Like, you can reproduce some exact thing, right? Like you can make it over and over again in the same way, right? But that's not what we mean by reproduction, especially in the concept of practice or performance, right? Like if you started a band and you could reproduce Green Day, like you just like make a perfect American Idiot album over again, people would think you were competent as a guitar player and a singer, and they'd think it was interesting, but they wouldn't think it was actually the album wouldn't be interesting. And you know, other than you kind of being a weirdo freak, it's not what they would mean by a good performance, right? You would be a cover band, right? And who cares? You wouldn't become famous in theory. On the other hand, there's this idea of reproducing practice by which you create some novelty enough to become your own identity, but you're also kind of playing in a tradition or in a way that allows you to be accessible to an audience so they can kind of, and then finally, you know, there's this idea, because I want to play off that novelty perspective just a little bit, right? Like, practice isn't valuable because it enables novelty. It's because it enables reproduction of something. And therefore, what is primarily happening in practice in like a band situation or in an organization is that the good performances involve the teams being able to hear each other and respond to each other well, to listen to each other. And that's really critical to understand that it's not inherently just valuable that you can make something novel or new. It's equally valuable or equally important that the kind of terminology here is the interpredictability of the teams is heightened by practice. So in other words, why are you safer doing one thing versus another thing in an organization? Well, you're safer because you will arrive at a predictable range of outcomes that other people can depend on, and therefore everyone's safe. So the practice is listening to each team's output and inputs and understanding that the practices are producing those outputs and inputs in a relational way. And then all of a sudden having this kind of experience of saying, oh, organizations who have a heightened sense of practice or have a heightened ability to practice their work are doing so because the teams are balanced in their relationship to each other, kind of like a good band is balanced in its relationship to each other. So I think that's kind of an important version of what Marc was trying to point at.
Something that came to mind while I was hearing both of you sort of describe these ideas was, so we keep coming back to performance as a way of thinking of this rather than behavior. And the band metaphor is kind of fun. And Jabe, I've heard you use the orchestra metaphor before. And what sort of started noodling about in my head was this like the difference between a jazz band and an orchestra.
Yep.
And a big band.
Yep.
And I was kind of just thinking about that a little bit, how individual skill is thought of in musical contexts. For an orchestra, you try to get the best of the best.
Yep.
And you really, at least it seems to be the case in a lot of situations, the idea is focused on individual excellence. And integration has to be high, like it's rigid, it's tight. Everybody's individually an excellent performer, but they fit within a much tighter structure that in a way is kind of not resilient. Or, as a performer, that's what I've experienced with some of the orchestras that I've been a part of. I mean, we're not talking anything fancy. We're talking like high school and college, blah, blah, blah. But that always seemed to be the way that failed in that context. But then we hear the way Marc described like a jazz ensemble, like a small group of people kind of getting together, jamming with each other. They are very, very much used to integration, and there's value not in avoiding failure, but in learning how to integrate and integrating past failure in a way so that most people don't even notice. You don't linger on it. And so I'm just kind of struck by this like parallel metaphor between enterprise organizations trying to like misunderstanding this integration idea. And I'm not saying orchestras are bad. There's probably like, that's not what I'm trying to say, but like enterprise organizations aiming for rigid integration by optimizing for individual excellence versus what if this big band kind of notion, thinking about, yes, we have this integration concept, and maybe we're not as flexible as these smaller jazz trios, but we're able to still kind of flex and focus on the integration. So hopefully what I've done is kind of create a little bit of a weird kind of thinking space. I have a really important question. A lot of organizations are focused on becoming some version of the orchestra or some version of the jazz ensemble or something along those lines. They are not those things now. They are terrible, but maybe large community bands with maybe lots of local politics and individual chairs and all this kind of stuff who are making good decisions, but they're optimized for what they optimize for. And they say, one day, we want to be great, right? And there's not really much disagreement in that term, right? Like everybody has the goals.
Yep.
How do you start? How do you start stepping forward?
So, I mean, I think the term right now that's used a lot of psychological safety or growth mindset or all these kind of fail fast. These are all related to the idea of creating a space where people have an opportunity to practice. And I mean practice both in the kind of social practice academic meaning that we mean it, but also just like practice. To get better at something by doing it repeatedly. And so I think that's the first step, is to realize that. And then the second step is to really honestly grapple with the idea that if you're taking what we're talking about seriously right now, you're not trying to create some sort of measurable outcome that can be rolled out across at scale. Right? There's not like, okay, TDD should have these metrics outcomes if you're doing them well, and therefore we should be able to measure whether or not everyone's doing well by measuring these same criteria across all different places. Right? That has very little to do with what we would mean by practice. And why is that important? Because really what we're trying to aim to get towards is what in resilience engineering they call adaptive capacity. And adaptive capacity is the ability to take your practice and apply it to novel problems. And this is really simple, is based on the idea that the novel problems are not going to go away. They're going to keep on happening. So what we really actually want to do is have a set of practices that enable us to practice engaging in those novel problems. So if we can kind of create stability or reproducibility, however you want to describe that idea of like having a kind of stable base of practice, when we encounter novel issues, we're not spending all of our adaptive capacity trying to figure out how to walk. We can apply that adaptive capacity then towards actual problem. And so like a really one that I like to point out is this. Organizations that have a misbalance between, say, development and ops, right? So developers creating crappy code, or let's just, instead of saying generally crappy, let's say inoperable. So, and I want to point out, like when I say inoperable, like you could have low tech debt, highly refined idiomatic code that's not operable. that when something goes wrong on it, the operators cannot understand what's going wrong and they can't fix it. They can't make it operate better, right? So operability is a quality of the code base that often developers don't see because they don't operate the code, someone else does. So they have little practice in the operation of their code, right? So then you get operators who basically absorb the variability created by the inoperable code. They absorb it and the developers never hear about it, right? Because they keep the system working. But the problem with that really basic version of it is that all the operators' adaptive capacity is being deployed to adapt stuff that could be improved. The developers could have a better understanding what operability is. They could make more operable code. They could work with the operators to understand how their code works in practice, in operation, and therefore they could improve that. And then they would increase the capacity, the adaptive capacity available to the operators, so that when there's a problem that neither the operators or the developers could have understood prior to it occurring, the adaptive capacity could be deployed towards actually solving that problem. So this is why, like, these clusters of practices and the way that they become imbalanced, or the way that coping with one side becomes a bad outcome for the other side eventually. Kind of the way that being a good citizen in the organization, trying to help and support somebody can bite you, is if you just keep doing that, then they can continue to produce the ill effect, right? So there's this weird version of design that basically says one of the problems that happens in design systems is that you design an intervention that allows the bad thing that's currently happening to continue happening, but without having effect on the overall outcome. So you improve the overall outcome, but actually the bad thing doesn't go away, right? And there's lots and lots of examples of that. In this case, in the case of practice, what we want is to have people create these stable constellations, understand the interrelationship between these practices and the clusters of practices in a way that allows them to increase the adaptive capacity so that you can go from, let's say, to use your metaphor, you can go from an orchestra where what we know is when someone plays a wrong note, and therefore what we try to do is eliminate the wrong things happening, yeah, with the theory that we can create a perfect reproduction of Tchaikovsky, right? Versus that's one kind of version of the world, and it's a version of the world that kind of has a platonic form of the music and reproduction of music built into it. And I'm totally being polemical here. Most orchestras certainly don't think that way, but that's what I think your average person would think about. Versus a jazz band, where all they do is deploy their adaptive capacity to be capable of kind of catching up and making a mistake into an interesting thing, right? By listening to each other very closely. But also, of course, I think most jazz musicians, their theory is impeccable. Like, they have heavy, theory involved. They know what's happening musically. Point being, you can shift from that kind of one mindset of like, what is going wrong and how do we eliminate it, to what is going right, how can we increase the amount of good things happening so that when something does go wrong, we can deploy our capacity for creativity, blah, 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 towards solving the problem. And I think it's a big difference. I think it's a really radical change in the way that people think about what they're doing in their organizations. So,
a quick caveat that I don't want to go over it, but I find the musical metaphor slightly difficult. So just knowing a lot about orchestra music, I have experienced people playing in orchestra being more capable of paying attention to what happens around them than some of the jazz musicians I played with.
Sure.
So
That's why I said I was being polemical. I was trying to avoid that trap, but I agree. I have like one of the PhD students in my cohort is actually he has been teaching for 20 years in CMU's music department, and we have lovely long discussions about music. And what he does is he trains future orchestra musicians, frankly, to do what's called eurythmics. And eurythmics is learning to use your body to express music. And naively, you would think it's like dancing, but it is not dance. It's a variant form of trying to help students understand musicality, and in particular, understanding that most of the music has very little to do with being able to reproduce the notes on the page. It has to do with understanding the relationship between the notes and the space in between the notes. That's where music occurs in his kind of way of teaching. So I think it's quite interesting.
Marc, to sort of close us out, I'm going to ask kind of the same question and sort of throw it your way as well. So what I'm worried about is that most will hear this conversation and they will replace one ideal future state with another ideal future state, and the former being individual evaluation to a rubric of maturity, of skill, where if it's test-driven development or whatever it ends up being, everyone in the organization has a skill chart and some have scored better than others in that test-driven development skill. And so it's this individually focused, individually skilled kind of atomistic idea of maturity in these skills. And posing the question to Jabe, we kind of heard how he would flip that frame from that model of thinking more towards, instead of driving out failure, sort of amplifying things that are already working. And I think that plays very nicely and rhymes very well with this like integration concept. But I like concretely, in your view, Marc.
I see what you did there.
Jabe, not to complain. But what will someone do differently tomorrow? And Jabe, I think I should give you a chance to retort at some point as well, but what could someone do tomorrow when they show up to work virtually, online, whatever, to think in this way, to be in this new way of thinking about maturity? What does the behavior look like?
That's a difficult one. What can you do tomorrow? Because, so first of all, it took me quite a while to get around to start seeing the world this way. And I would say I started looking at social practice or just practice theory with the advantage of actually having spent a long part of my life being comfortable with complexity concepts. And I still think that actually plays a big role in this. Because if your problems aren't complex, you probably don't need this. So what we say in complexity is you can't predict where you need to be tomorrow. So that already makes it difficult to tell somebody that's what you should do tomorrow, because even if you tell me where they were today, I can't anticipate from that where they will be tomorrow if they're in complexity. But the core thing I think that you should apply here is something that Jabe talks about. So yeah, he should come in later, but I'll just try to give you quickly. The whole idea that you want to become Google is absurd. It's literally absurd. So first of all, even if you became like Google, well, you're just imitating what Google does. That even if you do it perfectly, you have not learned anything about why did Google try the things that made them where they are. And hence, you still haven't learned how they're going to figure out how they want it, where they want to be tomorrow. Yeah. And so tomorrow you find out, oh, they moved on a bit. Now I need to copy that. And you copy that. So that's the absurdity of actually trying to copy what somebody else does as an outcome. Yeah. Because it doesn't make business sense. But almost guaranteed, your circumstances are different enough that even if you were able to perfectly copy what Google does, it wouldn't actually work for you as well as it does for Google. And just a small difference in environment can make all the difference in the outcome. Butterfly effect, etc., if we're in complexity. But what Jabe talks about is actually that if you look where you want to go, you should have just some sort of a vague direction. And then you actually need to look immediately in front of you, what is the next adjacent position in that direction that I think I could do. Yeah, and you just think about that progression. That's the big dog, also making an appearance. Just that, take a step in that direction, and then actually reevaluate and say, so I've gone in the direction that I think that's going to make things better in a certain way, certain value criteria, and then you can actually check, are these, so am I any closer to, does it really look closer? Yeah. You can't always immediately check, do I actually get any benefit from it as a material? So Marcus Andrusak always talks about the iPhone and puzzles about how would you keep the commitment for something that maybe takes 3 years to develop when actually all your first steps tell you, you won't figure out how to do this. Yeah. Now, every step you're taking is failure. So it does need a little persistence, but in principle, if you look ahead, you will stumble of everything that's right in front of you. So stop looking ahead all the time, start looking right in front of you. So practice theory in that sense would actually just say, start looking at the friction in your practice. So you're trying to do something, where do you actually experience friction? Yeah. And then there will, I mean, if you do this thoroughly, you will actually realize that's friction all around us. So then the direction is important. They say, I want to get to that kind of feeling or that kind of outcome. And you make an informed guess which of these frictions actually you really need to tackle in order to make progress, and you accept the other frictions to continue. And like if you're actually trying to find your way out of a geographical physical territory, every now and then you need to actually go and somewhere and say, okay, where am I now? Is this really where I wanted to go? Am I closer to water? Am I closer to, I don't know, some pasture where my cattle can graze? Or occasionally you need to, you know, do a little oodiddle. Go stick your head out and orient, observe and orient and make sure, yeah, okay, we are, or no, maybe this is not the right. Maybe we should turn around and go back to where we were and try another direction. And maybe you need to try a few directions before you can really judge which direction is the one that is more promising. So instead of actually looking at a big, far outcome, just say, okay, yeah, roughly we think it's that direction, but then look at what's in front of you. So Jabe says, in order to do that, we need to understand the current. So that is a concrete thing we're trying to do with maturity mapping, is give you a means to actually start visualizing your current in terms of the skills, the materials, the meanings, etc., what you're actually doing. And the belief, we think that we have mild success actually already using it, is that when you have a picture of that, your choices will become more obvious. Where it might pay off to make an experiment to see whether something improves in moving in a certain direction becomes more visible. Again, you maybe need to do a few moves to actually really see where your map might not quite be accurate yet and where you improve your map. But once your map starts to have a certain coherence, having a visualization of your current is almost a condition for making a successful step forward, whatever that direction is.
Yeah, so hearing what Marc is describing, but also knowing what Jabe has talked about with different kinds of thinking. He talks about ideal future thinking, talks about ideal present thinking, and understanding where you are is definitely important, because otherwise you're just in sort of, to borrow this, I'm probably going to bastardize it, but borrow Knevin's disorder concept, right? You don't actually understand where you are right now until you do. Yep. And so, Jabe, just a final question around this idea. so you start to learn about the present state,
Yep.
where you are.
Yep.
Start to notice that friction, and that seems like what Marc is pointing at. Start to notice the friction.
Yep.
What do you do with that?
So here's the main thing I want to get out of this idea of the ideal present in relation to practice. Practice is related to competency, and competency is related to the results of a practice. And it's related to the predictability and interpredictability of performing practices in clusters. So this all generally makes sense. I make a prediction, I do the thing, and the thing does what I expect it to do, right? And whether or not all those things are conscious or done in a reflective way, not trying to point towards that. But what I'm saying is we reproduce a state in the world over and over again, predictably, within a reasonable outcome. The eggs are not burnt and they're not raw. They're somewhere in between, and we have scrambled eggs, yeah? And so the importance of this, why am I saying that? One of the things about practice is that it's the judgment of the outcome, that the competency that you have, and there's a couple different ways that you can get that judgment, right? The further in the future your outcome is, the goal, the in-between has kind of like vague competency judgments, right? Like, how do I know that I am being competent towards a 5-year goal? Like, how can I? So part of what I mean by kind of being in the ideal present is you want to create opportunities for the judgment of competency in a time frame that people can actually see the competencies. And otherwise, what you end up doing is you bring in people to judge you. So a manager or an executive or an external consultant comes in and says, you're doing a good job or not. If you create good ideal presence, the judgment will come from the context, not from someone's opinion. Yeah. And when you overstretch, when you actually get outside of your ideal present, which is not, I don't think, bound in a particular temporality. There's multiple temporalities inside of organizations. But when you get the ideal present right for your temporality, the result of it will be that your competency will be judged in a way that you can observe by the results and the context itself speaking back to you, not someone else's opinion and not someone else's model and not some abstract, reproducible, forever form of what good looks like that you might call a maturity model. So the actual results will speak back to you. It will allow you to listen to what you are doing. And then you have an opportunity for reflective practice. So
like either you get scrambled eggs or you don't.
Yep. But you in that model, you don't say my goal is to have a breakfast restaurant. Yeah. You say my goal is, the first thing I need to do if I want to have a breakfast restaurant is say, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe that's what I want. I should probably like practice making waffles and pancakes and eggs, and I should determine if I have the ability to competently reproduce those things in a way that people will show up regularly to consume them from my restaurant, right? Just saying I want the restaurant doesn't get you there. And just going to restaurants and tasting other food doesn't get you there, right? Like going around and saying like, oh, this, like the chicken and waffles here is amazing. I should make that. I like going and collecting all of the outcomes that you want to have in the restaurant won't get you a restaurant, right? So I think that's part of what I'm trying to point at is teams, organizations will reflect on what they're capable of observing and what they're capable of judging, and use their practice to increase what they can make judgments about and whether or not those things are going well or not. And in particular, again, because we're talking about practice theory, I'm not saying that you should go out and buy a benchmark or that you should go out and buy a set of metrics from someone that will tell you you're doing it right. Because all of those things may in fact be ways of calibrating whether you're doing it right, but have nothing to do with learning how to do them right. Yeah. So you're present. What is present to you? What is literally what is observable to you? What is present to you defines what your ideal present is.
That was excellent. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Jabe.
I had fun. Thanks, guys.